I still remember the exact expression on Ellen's face when she saw 25 police officers lined up outside my food truck, right in front of her house. Her jaw practically hit the pristine sidewalk she'd had the HOA repave just last spring. But I'm getting ahead of myself. This isn't just a story about petty revenge. It's the tale of a 3-month battle with a power-hungry HOA president who was determined to destroy the small business I'd spent my life savings to build. I never thought selling authentic Latin fusion food would make me an enemy of the state, but here we are. If you're watching this video while enjoying your lunch break, or maybe during your commute home, drop a comment below and let me know where you're watching from. Trust me, you'll want to stick around for how this all plays out. My name is Miguel Rodriguez, and until 6 months ago, I was just another burnt-out accountant staring at spreadsheets in a downtown office building. After my father passed away unexpectedly, leaving me a modest inheritance and his book of family recipes, something clicked. Life's too short to spend it doing something you hate. So at 35, I did what any reasonable, stable adult with a secure career would do. I quit my job, cashed out my 401k, and sank everything into a food truck. Sabor Latino became my baby, a gleaming stainless steel kitchen on wheels painted in vibrant colors that stood out wherever I parked. I took my father's recipes, added my own modern fusion twists, and hit the streets of Oakwood Heights, a mid-sized California suburb with plenty of office workers hungry for something better than another sad sandwich. Business was good right from the start. I found a perfect spot on a public street bordering the upscale Oakwood Estates HOA neighborhood and adjacent to a small commercial area with several office buildings. The location was ideal. Plenty of foot traffic from office workers during lunch, neighborhood residents in the evenings, and completely legal according to city ordinances. I had all my permits, health inspections, and business licenses in perfect order. I'd done my homework, and for the first 6 months things ran smoothly. I was making enough to keep the business afloat and even starting to pay myself a modest salary. My customers were happy, I was happy, and life was finally feeling right. Then Ellen Whitfield entered the picture. I'll never forget our first encounter. It was a Wednesday afternoon and I'd just finished serving the lunch rush. I was wiping down the counter when a sharp tap, tap, tap on the service window made me look up. There stood Ellen, impeccably dressed in a cream-colored pantsuit, her silver blonde bob not moving an inch despite the light breeze. She wore the kind of frozen smile that never quite reaches the eyes. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with practiced politeness. "I'm Ellen Whitfield, president of the Oakwood Estates Homeowners Association, and I'm afraid we have a problem with your establishment." The way she said establishment made it sound like I was running an underground gambling den rather than selling award-worthy empanadas. I gave her my best customer service smile and explained that I had all the proper permits to operate on this public street. "I understand your concern, ma'am," I said, "but I'm not actually on HOA property. This is city property, and I have all the necessary permits." I even offered to show her my paperwork, but she waved it away as if I'd tried to hand her a used tissue. Her smile tightened, the corners of her mouth stretching like plastic wrap pulled too thin. "Well, Mr. Rodriguez," she said, emphasizing my last name in a way that made me immediately uncomfortable. "Permits or not, your truck is an eyesore that's affecting our property values, and the smell is simply overwhelming our residents. We'll see how long you last here." "I have many friends at City Hall." With that, she turned and walked away, her sensible heels clicking decisively on the pavement. What I didn't know then was that this was just the opening salvo in what would become an organized campaign to drive me out of business. I had no idea that I would have to learn to fight dirty just to survive, or that this affluent neighborhood association president had a long history of cleaning up the neighborhood in ways that primarily targeted small business owners who didn't fit her vision of what Oakwood Heights should be. The next week passed uneventfully, and I almost forgot about my encounter with Ellen. Business continued to thrive, and I even started experimenting with new menu items. My father's recipe for chili lime shrimp tacos was proving particularly popular with the office crowd. I had settled into a comfortable routine: prep work in the early morning, serving from 11 a.m. to 7 p.m., then clean up and prep for the next day. It wasn't easy work, but it was satisfying in a way that balancing corporate ledgers never had been. Every night I'd fall into bed exhausted but fulfilled, knowing I was building something of my own, honoring my father's memory with every dish I served. That peaceful existence was shattered on a Tuesday morning when a health inspector showed up unannounced. Dave Johnson was a tired-looking man in his 50s who seemed as though he'd rather be anywhere else. He flashed his badge and informed me that they'd received several anonymous complaints about my food handling practices. I was surprised, but not worried. I ran a clean operation and was meticulous about food safety. My father had drilled those principles into me from the moment I was tall enough to reach the kitchen counter. I welcomed Dave inside and stood by as he conducted an extremely thorough inspection, checking every corner of my small mobile kitchen, examining my refrigeration temps, storage practices, and even the temperature of the water in my hand-washing sink. After nearly 2 hours of scrutiny, he couldn't find a single violation. As he was preparing to leave, I noticed him hesitate. "Look," Dave said, lowering his voice slightly, "between you and me, this isn't normal. We don't usually respond to anonymous complaints with a full inspection unless there's a pattern of issues. Someone's really pushing for this." I remembered Ellen's parting words about having friends at City Hall and felt a chill that had nothing to do with the refrigeration unit. Dave handed me my perfect inspection certificate and added, "Just keep everything by the book. I have a feeling I'll be back." I thanked him for his professionalism and the warning, watching as he drove away. That night, I started keeping a detailed log of every interaction and incident, a habit from my accounting days that would prove invaluable in the weeks to come. 3 days later, I arrived at my usual spot to find a parking ticket on the curb where I normally parked. According to the citation, I had violated a commercial vehicle restriction despite having parked in exactly the same spot for months without issue. As I stood there, staring at the ticket in disbelief, I felt eyes on me. Looking up, I spotted Ellen Whitfield watching from the corner, a satisfied smile playing on her lip. When our eyes met, she didn't look away or pretend she hadn't been watching. Instead, she raised her coffee mug and a mock toast before turning and walking toward the HOA community center. The message was clear. This was just the beginning. I paid the ticket. It wasn't worth fighting yet, but I also began documenting everything. I took daily photos of my parking spot to prove I was in compliance with all posted regulations. I collected and organized all my permits, licenses, and inspection reports. I started recording my daily interactions and making note of any unusual occurrences. I didn't know exactly what Ellen was planning, but I knew I needed to be prepared. What I couldn't figure out was why she had targeted me specifically. Was it just because my truck was visible from her pristine neighborhood, or was there something more to her vendetta? I needed to understand my enemy if I was going to have any chance of surviving this. As luck would have it, understanding came in the form of a regular customer named Jenny Williams, a paralegal at a law firm in one of the nearby office buildings. Jenny had become a loyal customer over the past few months, often chatting with me while waiting for her order. When I mentioned the mysterious parking ticket and my suspicions about Ellen, Jenny's normally friendly expression hardened. "Ellen Whitfield?" she asked, her voice tight. "Tall, silver bob, perpetually looks like she's smelling something unpleasant." When I nodded, Jenny let out a low whistle. "You've got yourself a genuine problem there, Miguel. That woman is notorious in legal circles around here. She's been sued multiple times, though nothing ever sticks because she's careful. Her late husband was the former police chief, and she's got connections all over the city. She's been running that HOA like her personal kingdom for nearly a decade." Over the next few days, I gathered more information about Ellen from various sources. Jenny helped by discreetly asking around her office, and several of my regular customers who lived in the area contributed what they knew. The picture that emerged was troubling. Ellen Whitfield was a widow in her late 50s who had previously worked in property management before taking over the Oakwood Estates HOA. Her late husband had been the police chief until his retirement 5 years ago, leaving her with extensive connections in local law enforcement and city government. Under her leadership, the HOA had become increasingly restrictive, with a particular focus on maintaining property values by enforcing ever more stringent regulations about everything from lawn care to holiday decorations. But the most disturbing information came from Robert Chen, the former owner of a small Asian fusion restaurant that had operated near the edge of the HOA's territory. Robert had been driven out of business 2 years earlier after a sustained campaign of harassment that sounded eerily similar to what I was experiencing: health inspections, parking issues, and mysterious complaints. "She doesn't want businesses like ours near her precious neighborhood," Robert told me when I tracked him down at his new job as a kitchen manager at a chain restaurant across town. "She has this vision of turning Oakwood Heights into some exclusive enclave, and small ethnic food businesses don't fit that image. She'll use every connection she has to make your life miserable until you give up and leave." Armed with this knowledge, I began to understand what I was up against. Ellen wasn't just a cranky neighbor complaining about the smell of cumin and chili. She was a well-connected local power player with a specific agenda and the means to enforce it. I needed to be smarter and more strategic if I was going to survive. Fortunately, the harassment had an unexpected side effect. It made me determined to stay. What had started as a simple career change was now becoming a matter of principle. I would not be bullied away from a legal business location by someone who thought she owned public streets. Ellen's next move came the following week when I arrived at my spot to find it occupied by a large SUV. The vehicle was parked legally and there was nothing I could do about it except find another spot further down the block away from the prime foot traffic area. The next day, a different vehicle was in my usual spot, and the pattern continued all week. It wasn't illegal, just infuriating. And it was costing me business. My customer count dropped by nearly 30% that week as office workers couldn't find me in my usual location during their limited lunch breaks. I had no proof that Ellen was behind it, but the timing was too convenient to be coincidental. I was contemplating my options one slow afternoon when a patrol car pulled up beside my truck. My heart sank. Was this another level of harassment? But when the officer approached, his friendly smile put me at ease. "Hey there," he said. "I'm Officer Thomas Rodriguez. No relation, I'm guessing, but it's a good name." He ordered 2 of my special tacos and struck up a conversation while waiting. Thomas was easy to talk to, and before long I found myself sharing my troubles with Ellen and the HOA. To my surprise, he nodded knowingly. "Yeah, Ellen Whitfield has a certain reputation around the precinct," he admitted after glancing around to ensure no one was listening. "She's always dropping her late husband's name to try to get special treatment. Between us, most of the guys got tired of her attitude years ago. We tolerate her out of respect for the chief, but that doesn't mean we like her." That casual conversation gave me the first glimmer of an idea, a crazy, possibly brilliant idea that would take time to develop. But before I could put any plan into action, I needed to shore up my defenses. Jenny had offered her legal expertise pro bono, outraged by what she saw as clear harassment and abuse of power. "I can't promise we can stop her completely," Jenny warned as we sat in a coffee shop going over my documentation, "but we can make sure you're legally protected. She's being careful to stay just on the right side of harassment laws, but if we can establish a pattern, we might be able to push back." Just as we were developing our defensive strategy, Ellen escalated her attacks in a way I hadn't anticipated. I woke up one morning to find my online restaurant ratings in free fall. Dozens of one-star reviews had appeared overnight, all claiming to have experienced food poisoning or found foreign objects in their food. These were obvious fakes. Many described menu items I didn't even offer. But the damage to my online reputation was immediate and severe. Simultaneously, the health department received multiple anonymous reports of food safety violations, forcing Dave Johnson to return for another complete inspection. He was apologetic but had no choice. Complaints had to be investigated. "This is getting ridiculous," Dave muttered as he once again found my kitchen spotless. "Someone really has it out for you." He hesitated, then lowered his voice. "Listen, I shouldn't tell you this, but the complaints are all coming from the same IP address. We can't prove who it is, but—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. We both knew who was behind it. The fake reviews and health complaints were damaging, but what happened next nearly broke me. I was wiping down the truck one evening after closing when Jenny called me, her voice urgent. "Miguel, you need to get to Marino's restaurant right now. Table in the back corner. Don't let them see you." Marino's was an upscale Italian place just a few blocks away, popular with the local business and government crowd. I slipped into Marino's and positioned myself at the bar where I could observe the back corner without being obvious. What I saw made my blood boil. Ellen was dining with Councilman James Peterson, the head of the city's zoning commission. I couldn't hear their conversation, but their body language told me everything I needed to know. Ellen was leaning forward intensely, occasionally gesturing in what I assumed was the direction of my usual parking spot. Peterson looked uncomfortable but was nodding along. Using my phone as discreetly as possible, I recorded a short video of their meeting, making sure to capture both their faces clearly. It wasn't much, but it confirmed my suspicions. Ellen was trying to change the zoning regulations to ban food trucks in the area. The next day, my sister Maria arrived from San Diego. I had called her in desperation, knowing her background in marketing and social media might help counter the fake review assault. Maria was 4 years younger than me, but infinitely more savvy about the digital world. She took one look at the situation and switched into crisis management mode. "We need to mobilize your real customers," she explained as she set up a temporary command center on my kitchen table. "These fake reviews are obvious if you know what to look for, all posted within hours of each other. New accounts with no review history, generic complaints. We'll start a hashtag campaign and ask your loyal customers to post their honest experiences." Within days, Maria had organized a Support Sabor Latino social media campaign that was gaining traction locally. While Maria worked her magic online, Jenny continued building our legal defense. Through her contacts, she discovered that Ellen had attempted similar tactics with other businesses in the past. Most had eventually given up and moved away, unable to withstand the constant harassment and financial strain. But Jenny also uncovered something unexpected, a pattern of questionable financial transactions within the HOA under Ellen's leadership. "She's been using HOA funds for some potentially inappropriate purposes," Jenny explained, showing me copies of financial records that another resident had leaked to her. Nothing blatantly illegal, but definitely in ethical gray areas. Like using maintenance funds to improve the areas near her home first, or hiring her niece's landscaping company at above-market rates. Our defensive measures were helping, but Ellen wasn't backing down. If anything, her attacks became more brazen. One morning, I arrived to find my truck had been vandalized overnight. Nothing major, just some scratched paint and graffiti, but the message was clear. I immediately installed security cameras, which caught someone trying to slash my tires 2 nights later. The footage wasn't clear enough to identify the perpetrator conclusively, but it was enough to file a police report. Officer Rodriguez took the report personally, his expression grim as he reviewed the footage. "This is crossing a line," he said quietly. "Harassing a legitimate business is one thing, but vandalism and attempted property damage are criminal acts." Thomas, as he'd asked me to call him off duty, shared an interesting tidbit that day. "You know," he said as he was finishing up the report, "Ellen's always bragging about her connections with the police department, but the truth is most officers can't stand her. She treats us like her personal security force because of who her husband was. She's constantly calling in noise complaints and parking violations in her neighborhood. The only reason anyone even responds anymore is out of respect for the former chief." This information confirmed what I had been slowly piecing together. Ellen's power came largely from perception rather than reality. She relied on people believing she had influence, which discouraged them from challenging her. As Ellen's attacks continued, our small resistance group grew. Jenny brought in Sophia Patel, a former HOA board secretary who had resigned in protest over Ellen's leadership style. Sophia had kept copies of questionable HOA meeting minutes and financial transactions. "Ellen runs that board through intimidation," Sophia explained over coffee in my tiny apartment. Most members just rubber stamp whatever she wants because it's easier than facing her wrath. She's been talking about expanding the HOA's sphere of influence beyond its legal boundaries for years. This explained her fixation on my food truck. It wasn't just about one business, but about extending her control over the public areas adjacent to the HOA property. Things came to a head when I learned from Sophia that Ellen was planning a major HOA event at her home, an annual community gathering that would include several city officials and influential HOA members. This formal garden party was Ellen's chance to showcase her leadership and reinforce her connections with local power players. It was scheduled for the following Saturday, starting at 4 p.m. As Sophia described the event, a plan began forming in my mind. The public street where I typically parked my truck ran directly in front of Ellen's house. While she could, and did, make my life difficult through various means, she had no legal authority to prevent me from parking there. It was public property, not HOA territory. What if, I said slowly, thinking out loud, I planned a special event of my own that day, right in front of her house? Jenny looked concerned. You'd need to be careful not to cross any lines into harassment yourself, she cautioned. But if you're conducting legitimate business in a place you're legally entitled to be... Her voice trailed off as she considered the possibilities. Maria, ever the marketing expert, immediately caught on. A promotion. Something that would bring a crowd, but for a positive reason. Something she couldn't reasonably complain about without looking bad. That's when I remembered my conversation with Thomas about the police department's tepid relationship with Ellen, despite her constant name-dropping. What about a Thank Law Enforcement Day, I suggested. Free meals for all police officers as a community appreciation event. The idea took shape rapidly. I would park my truck in my usual legal spot, which happened to be directly visible from Ellen's front windows. On the day of her important HOA function, I would offer free meals to any law enforcement officer who showed up, creating a legitimate, positive community event that Ellen couldn't object to without revealing her true colors. Maria immediately saw the potential and began sketching a social media campaign. Jenny reviewed the legal aspects and confirmed there was nothing actionable about offering discounts or free meals to specific groups. Restaurants did it all the time for veterans, teachers, and first responders. Over the next week, our plan evolved from a vague concept into a detailed operation. Maria created professional-looking digital flyers announcing Sabor Latino Appreciates Our Officers Day, with the date, time, and special menu items named after local police heroes. Officer Rodriguez, who was now fully in our corner after the vandalism incident, agreed to spread the word around the precinct. Most of the guys have been wanting to try your food anyway, he told me with a grin. Free tacos will just give them the excuse they need. Jenny continued to ensure everything we did was legally sound, while Sophia provided insider information about Ellen's event preparations and the growing anxiety among HOA board members about my continued presence. To my surprise, we gained another unexpected ally in Greg Thompson, the HOA vice president. Greg had always been uncomfortable with Ellen's tactics, but had been too intimidated to speak up. After Sophia reached out to him confidentially, he agreed to meet me at a coffee shop far from Oakwood Heights. I didn't sign up for harassment campaigns, he said, his voice low, despite the fact that no one we knew was around. I joined the board to help maintain our community standards, not to run some kind of exclusionary zone. Ellen's gone too far, but most board members are afraid to challenge her. Greg provided valuable information about the internal tensions within the HOA and confirmed that Ellen had been using association resources inappropriately to pursue her vendetta against me. As the day of our dueling events approached, Ellen made increasingly desperate attempts to derail my plans. She tried to have the city revoke my vendor permit based on the fake complaints, but Dave Johnson's thorough inspections and clear reports stymied that effort. She attempted to have the police department declare my planned appreciation event as unauthorized, only to discover that Captain Frank Morales, the precinct commander, had already approved officers attending while on break. Her most audacious move was trying to arrange for emergency street maintenance on the day of the event. but the City Works Department wasn't willing to schedule non-essential work without proper advance notice. The night before our event, disaster struck. I went to prep my truck for the following day and discovered the engine wouldn't start. A quick inspection by a mobile mechanic confirmed my worst fear. Someone had deliberately damaged the fuel line and tampered with the electrical system. The sabotage was subtle enough to look like mechanical failure, but severe enough to render the truck inoperable. The security camera I had installed had been cleverly disabled before the tampering occurred. I had no direct proof of Ellen's involvement, but the timing was too perfect to be coincidental. I was devastated. All our planning, all our work, ruined by this final, desperate act of sabotage. I called my small team together for an emergency meeting at my apartment. "We can still make this work," Maria insisted, always the optimist. "We just need a backup plan." But what could we do without a food truck? That's when Robert Chen, who had become part of our support network, offered an unexpected solution. "I still have my old food cart in storage," he said. "It's not as big as your truck, but it's functional. You could use it for tomorrow if you want." It wasn't ideal. The cart was smaller and couldn't handle the volume I had planned for. But it was our only option. We spent the night cleaning Robert's cart, transferring as much of my prep work as possible, and modifying our plans to work with the smaller setup. The morning of the showdown arrived bright and clear. Perfect weather for an outdoor event. I arrived early to claim my spot, half expecting Ellen to have implemented some new obstacle. Sure enough, as I was setting up Robert's cart, a tow truck pulled up alongside me. The driver approached with a clipboard. "Got a report of an abandoned vehicle scheduled for removal," he said, glancing at his paperwork. Before I could respond, Jenny stepped forward from where she had been watching nearby. "There must be some mistake," she said, her lawyer voice in full effect. "This is a licensed food vendor operating legally on public property. I'd be happy to show you the permits." The tow truck driver looked uncertain, and at that moment, Thomas pulled up in his patrol car, still in uniform from his night shift. "Everything okay here?" Thomas asked, his authoritative presence immediately changing the dynamic. The tow truck driver, now faced with a lawyer and a police officer, quickly backpedaled. "Just a mix-up in the paperwork, I guess," he muttered before retreating to his truck and driving away. We had barely finished setting up when Ellen emerged from her house, already dressed for her afternoon garden party in an expensive-looking floral dress and pearls. Her face contorted with rage when she saw us, and she marched directly over, smartphone in hand as if ready to call in every favor she was owed. "You can't be here today," she hissed, all pretense of politeness gone. "I'm hosting an important community function, and this eyesore will ruin everything." I maintained my composure, aware that Jenny was recording the interaction on her phone and that several early morning joggers from the neighborhood had slowed to watch the confrontation. "Good morning, Ms. Whitfield," I said pleasantly. "We're just setting up for our law enforcement appreciation event. All proper permits are in order." I gestured to the clearly displayed permits on Robert's cart. "As you can see, we're operating completely within city regulations on this public street." Ellen's face flushed deeper. "I'll have this shut down immediately," she threatened. "One call to the precinct and—" "The precinct is aware and supportive of this community event," Thomas interjected, still standing nearby. "In fact, Captain Morales sends his regards. He's looking forward to stopping by later." Ellen seemed momentarily thrown by the realization that her police connections weren't going to help her this time. She recovered quickly, though, falling back on threats. "This isn't over, Rodriguez," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "I promise you'll regret this little stunt." With that, she turned and stalked back to her house, already on her phone, presumably trying to find someone with the authority to remove us. Jenny stopped recording and smiled grimly. That's going to be useful if she tries anything else. Clear threat caught on camera. The encounter had drawn attention, and several curious neighbors had gathered to see what was happening. Sophia, who had been distributing flyers nearby, seized the opportunity to engage them, explaining our event and subtly highlighting Ellen's opposition to a positive community initiative supporting law enforcement. By 11 a.m., officers began arriving for early lunch breaks. Maria had coordinated with the precinct to stagger their visits throughout the day to ensure we could handle the volume with our smaller setup. Each officer who arrived was greeted warmly and offered a choice from our special menu. Many expressed genuine appreciation for the gesture, especially after Thomas quietly spread the word about the ongoing situation with Ellen. What had started as a strategic countermove was evolving into a genuinely positive community event. Local residents stopped by to chat with the officers, creating exactly the kind of neighborhood connection that Ellen claimed to value but actually undermined with her exclusionary tactics. The crowd grew steadily throughout the day. News of free food for officers spread quickly through the department, and many brought partners or family members who purchased meals, actually increasing my sales despite the giveaway to officers. A local news van even showed up. Maria had sent press releases to several outlets, and reporter Sarah Kim from the local affiliate found the community appreciation event angle appealing. "How did you come up with this idea?" Sarah asked, microphone in hand, cameraman capturing the growing line of officers and community members. I gave her my most sincere smile. "Food brings people together. I wanted to thank the officers who keep our community safe and create a positive space for neighbors to connect." By 3:30 p.m., as Ellen's garden party guests began to arrive, the scene in front of her house was not what she had envisioned. Instead of a quiet, elegant approach to her carefully manicured property, her guests had to navigate past a vibrant community gathering with police officers, local residents, and even a news crew. Many of her guests, curious about the activities, stopped to investigate before continuing to her event, and several even purchased food. From my position at the cart, I could see Ellen standing at her front door, face rigid with barely contained fury as she greeted arrivals who were distracted by the festivities occurring just yards away on the public street. The situation reached its climax around 5 p.m. when Captain Frank Morales arrived with several other high-ranking officers. They had been invited to Ellen's function as respected community figures, but stopped at my cart first, partly out of curiosity and partly because Thomas had given them a heads-up about the situation. Ellen, who had been monitoring the street while attempting to host her garden party, spotted the officers chatting amicably with me instead of proceeding directly to her event. In what would prove to be a catastrophic error of judgment, she stormed out of her house and confronted the group, her careful public persona finally cracking completely. "This is completely inappropriate," Ellen's voice carried clearly across the gathering as she approached Captain Morales. Her garden party dress, an expensive floral number she'd likely chosen to project the image of a welcoming community leader, now seemed at odds with the fury contorting her face. The pearls at her neck trembled with each angry word. "You were invited to a legitimate community function, not this illegal street vendor spectacle." The crowd around us quieted, conversations dying mid-sentence as attention shifted to the confrontation. Even the sizzling from my grill seemed to soften, as if the food itself was listening. Captain Morales, a dignified man in his 50s with salt and pepper hair and a reputation for unflappable fairness, looked genuinely surprised at being addressed so aggressively in public. He straightened to his full height, the relaxed posture he'd maintained while chatting with me instantly transforming into the alert stance of a senior officer assessing a situation. "Ms. Whitfield," he said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority that came from decades of commanding respect, "I was planning to attend both events. Mr. Rodriguez is hosting a Community Appreciation Day for law enforcement, which I find commendable. There's no reason these two community gatherings can't coexist peacefully." Ellen's perfectly made-up face flushed deeper, the careful facade of community leadership she'd maintained for years cracking visibly with each passing second. Several of her garden party guests had now emerged from her property, cocktails in hand, watching with expressions ranging from embarrassment to barely concealed fascination. I recognized the city councilman and the head of the local chamber of commerce among them, both looking distinctly uncomfortable. "He's only doing this to sabotage my event." Ellen's voice rose sharply, the carefully modulated tones she typically used in HOA meetings abandoned entirely. He's been a nuisance to this neighborhood for months, deliberately lowering property values with that garish truck and those cooking smells, and now he's deliberately provoking me." Her voice had risen to a near shout, causing even more of her garden party guests to drift toward the commotion. I maintained my position behind the food cart, conscious that every eye was now darting between Ellen and me. Thomas had subtly shifted to stand closer to me, a protective gesture that wasn't lost on the other officers present. Jenny was recording everything on her phone, her expression professional but with a hint of satisfaction at seeing Ellen finally expose her true nature publicly. Maria stood nearby, looking both concerned and oddly validated. After all, this meltdown was precisely what our plan had aimed to provoke, though none of us had expected it to unfold so dramatically or effectively. What happened next was both unexpected and, in retrospect, inevitable, like watching a pressure cooker finally blow after the safety valve had been deliberately tampered with. In her increasingly agitated state, Ellen began making accusations that revealed far more than she intended, each word digging her grave deeper. "I have tried everything to get rid of him," she exclaimed, gesturing wildly toward me, her designer bracelet catching the afternoon sunlight. "Health inspections, parking complaints, zoning challenges. I've called in every favor I could, but he just won't leave." Her voice cracked slightly as frustration overwhelmed her. "Do you know how much time and money I've spent trying to protect our neighborhood from these kinds of undesirable elements? I've had to personally coordinate with city officials, fabricate resident complaints, even arrange for that ridiculous truck to be damaged." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. Even I was shocked at how completely she had incriminated herself. Sarah Kim's cameraman had swiveled to capture every word, the red recording light glowing steadily like an accusatory eye. Captain Morales's expression darkened progressively, the polite diplomatic mask replaced by the stern countenance of a law enforcement officer confronting a confessed perpetrator. "Are you saying," he asked, enunciating each word with deliberate clarity, "that you have been deliberately targeting a legitimate business owner with false complaints and criminal property damage, Ms. Whitfield?" The emphasis he placed on her name stripped it of all respectability, transforming it from a title of community leadership to the identifier of a petty criminal. Ellen seemed to suddenly realize what she had admitted. Her eyes widened as she glanced around at the crowd of witnesses, officers, neighbors, HOA members, media, all watching her with expressions ranging from shock to disgust. She attempted to backtrack, her hand fluttering to her throat. That's not what I meant. You're twisting my words. I was speaking hypothetically." But the damage was done. Her words hung in the air like a signed confession, impossible to retract or reinterpret. From the edge of the crowd, Sophia stepped forward. I hadn't noticed her arrival, but she had positioned herself perfectly, waiting for precisely this moment. Unlike Ellen's garden party finery, Sophia wore a simple but professional blue dress, her expression resolute as she faced the woman who had bullied her into resigning from the HOA board. "It's not just Miguel," she said, her voice clear and steady, carrying to every corner of the now silent gathering. "Ellen has been systematically misusing HOA funds and authority to target multiple businesses and residents who don't fit her vision of what Oakwood Heights should be. She's been doing it for years." The accusation hung in the air for a moment before Greg Thompson, who had been observing from nearby with a group of HOA residents, stepped forward to join Sophia. The significance wasn't lost on anyone present, especially Ellen, whose eyes widened at this betrayal from her own vice president. Greg, typically so deferential in HOA meetings, stood tall as he finally made his public stand against Ellen. "As vice president of the HOA, I've become increasingly concerned about these practices," he stated, pulling a folder from his messenger bag. "I've brought documentation of questionable financial transactions that the board never properly approved, including using maintenance funds to hire private investigators to monitor Miguel's business and diverting community garden money to pay for legal consultations about how to modify zoning regulations." One of Ellen's garden party guests, a woman in an expensive suit who I recognized as a local judge, slowly set down her wine glass and stepped away from Ellen's side, her expression hardening. Other guests began murmuring among themselves, some openly staring at Ellen with newfound suspicion. The situation was spiraling beyond Ellen's control, her carefully constructed facade of community leadership crumbling before everyone's eyes like a sandcastle at high tide. Captain Morales surveyed the scene thoughtfully, his years of experience in handling community disputes evident in how he took a moment to assess before speaking. When he finally did, the authority in his voice commanded immediate attention. "Mr. Whitfield," he began, his tone formal and measured, "these are serious allegations that merit further investigation. Filing false reports to city agencies is a misdemeanor offense under California law, and misappropriation of HOA funds could potentially involve civil or criminal penalties depending on the circumstances. At minimum, we're looking at abuse of process, potential fraud, filing false reports, and possibly conspiracy." The legal terminology seemed to hit Ellen like physical blows. Her face, previously flushed with rage, had now gone from red to ashen, the color draining away to leave her looking suddenly older and smaller. She glanced frantically around for allies but found none. Even those who had arrived as her guests were now keeping a careful distance, as if her disgrace might be contagious. "This is ridiculous," she stammered, her voice having lost all its previous authority. "You can't possibly believe these people over me. My husband—" "Your husband was a respected officer who upheld the law," Captain Morales interrupted firmly, his expression hardening at the attempted invocation of her connection to the former police chief. "I worked under Chief Whitfield for 15 years, and I can tell you with certainty that he would be deeply disappointed to see his name used this way. I suggest you remember that before invoking his name to intimidate others or seek special treatment." This rebuke, delivered in front of the community she had sought to rule, seemed to strike Ellen at her core. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her as I watched the last vestiges of her power and influence visibly crumble. Almost. Then I remembered the months of harassment, the damage to my business, the stress and fear she had deliberately caused, and my sympathy evaporated like morning dew. The confrontation had drawn Ellen's garden party to a complete halt, with guests now openly watching the drama unfold. Some were visibly uncomfortable, others seemed almost satisfied to see Ellen finally called to account. In a desperate attempt to reassert control, Ellen turned to me. "This is all your fault," she hissed, stepping toward me aggressively. "You've ruined everything." For a moment, I thought she might actually try to physically attack me or the food cart, but Officer Rodriguez smoothly stepped between us. "Ma'am, I'm going to have to ask you to step back and calm down," he said, his tone professional but firm. Creating a public disturbance would only complicate matters further. Ellen stared at him for a long moment, then at the circle of witnesses surrounding her, police officers, neighbors, HOA members, and even news reporter Sarah Kim, whose cameraman was capturing everything. The reality of her situation seemed to finally sink in. Without another word, she turned and walked stiffly back to her house, leaving her confused guests behind. The garden party was effectively over before it had really begun. As Ellen disappeared inside, a strange quiet fell over the gathering, broken only when Captain Morales turned to me. "Those tacos smell amazing, Mr. Rodriguez. I believe you mentioned they were complimentary for officers?" His deliberate lightening of the mood broke the tension, and the community event gradually resumed its positive atmosphere. The aftermath of what locals came to call the Oakwood Showdown unfolded more rapidly than anyone expected. By the following morning, Sarah Kim's report had aired on local news and was spreading through social media, featuring both the positive community event and Ellen's public meltdown. Within 3 days, an emergency HOA board meeting was called, where Ellen was confronted with the financial irregularities Greg and Sophia had documented. Faced with overwhelming evidence and the prospect of legal consequences, Ellen resigned from her position as HOA president. Sophia was elected interim president with a mandate to reform the organization's governance and financial practices. The city launched investigations into Ellen's misuse of municipal resources, including the false health and safety complaints. Dave Johnson personally apologized to me for the unnecessary inspections, though I assured him he had only been doing his job. The police department, under Captain Morales' leadership, reviewed its community engagement policies to ensure that personal connections couldn't be exploited to harass law-abiding citizens. Ellen herself became increasingly isolated as neighbors who had long feared crossing her now felt emboldened to share their own stories of intimidation and overreach. As for me, the publicity surrounding the event actually boosted my business. The damaged food truck was repaired using funds from a community-initiated GoFundMe campaign that Robert started. Regular customers who had been scared away by the fake reviews returned, and new customers arrived daily, curious about the food truck that had stood up to HOA. Jenny helped me file a civil suit against Ellen for business interference, which we eventually settled out of court for an amount that allowed me to put a down payment on a small brick-and-mortar location just a few blocks from my usual spot, while still maintaining the food truck for events and lunchtime service. Ellen's final defeat came 3 months later when, unable to face the community she had once ruled, she put her house on the market. Property values hadn't suffered from my food truck's presence. If anything, the increased community engagement and positive press had made Oakwood Heights more desirable. But Ellen's reputation was irreparably damaged. No one wanted to buy from or sell to the HOA Karen, whose actions had made local news. She eventually sold her immaculate colonial home for well below asking price and moved to a retirement community in Arizona, where I heard she was already campaigning for a position on their resident council. Some people never learn. 1 year after the showdown, we held a community victory celebration in the small park adjacent to my new restaurant. The event featured both the food truck and samples from the restaurant menu, with Thomas, Jenny, Maria, Sophia, Greg, Robert, and Captain Morales as honored guests. Looking around at the diverse crowd of neighbors, police officers, and loyal customers, I realized that Ellen had inadvertently given me something valuable, not just a thriving business, but a true connection to this community that I might never have formed otherwise. Her attempt to drive me away had instead helped me put down roots. The HOA, under Sophia's leadership, had transformed into a more transparent and inclusive organization, focused on genuine community improvement rather than restrictive enforcement. They had even established a small business liaison committee to ensure better relationships with local entrepreneurs. Greg Thompson headed this committee and often stopped by the restaurant for lunch, proudly bringing potential new business owners to meet me and hear my story. The health department, police force, and city offices had implemented new safeguards against the abuse of reporting systems, requiring more verification before launching investigations based on anonymous complaints. With the proceeds from my now thriving business, I established a small scholarship fund for young entrepreneurs interested in starting food-based businesses, particularly those from immigrant families like my own. The first recipient was a young woman who wanted to start a dessert truck featuring her grandmother's Caribbean recipes. Watching her excitement as she worked on her business plan reminded me of myself a year earlier. Full of hope and determination, unaware of the challenges ahead but passionate enough to face them. I provided not just financial support but mentorship, sharing the lessons I'd learned about both food service and fighting unjust systems. My experience had taught me that no business is truly small when it becomes a hub that connects an entire community. And no bully is truly powerful when people stand together against injustice. While I never set out to become a symbol of resistance against HOA overreach, I'm proud that my story has inspired others to stand their ground when faced with intimidation and abuse of power. These days, when people ask how Sabor Latino got started, I tell them it began with a food truck, an angry HOA president, and a plate of free tacos that changed everything. If you've ever faced a bully or someone who abused their power to try to push you around, I hope this story gives you some inspiration. Sometimes, standing your ground and fighting back intelligently is not just about winning. It's about creating something better than what existed before. Thanks for watching, and if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share. I'll be back next week with another tale from behind the counter of Sabor Latino. Until then, remember that the best revenge isn't just success, It's building community while you succeed.